Well, good morning from London. It's a real delight to be having another FS Club webinar. Today's subject is anti-money laundering. This is being sponsored by the Financial Services Group of livery companies who have an anti-money laundering task force. This is one of a series of approximately 8 now, examining if money laundering is so important, why can't it be simplified and strengthened? And we're here today to discuss the systemic long-term effects of AML technologies. And I'm here with two dear friends of mine, Dr. Dionysios Demetis, dialing in from Hull, and Professor Ian Angell, dialing in from Wales. And one of the great things, of course, is that Ian was my thesis advisor. And so it's a real delight to have sort of the whole team back together again. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien. But more importantly, I'm delighted to introduce these webinars because it's only due to the generosity of our sponsors who allow us to have open discussions ranging widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And of course, today we really are bringing all three together, the technology in these AML systems, the finance that they're supposedly directed at, and looking at the systemic and even economic effects of them. Now, the program today is going to be that I'll get out of the way as soon as I can so that you can hear from our main speakers. Dionysios will be leading off for about 15 minutes, and Ian will have a bit of a riposte for about 10. But I am anticipating quite a vibrant discussion. When both of them have been here for live events, the audience has really lit up, and I assume our virtual audience will be the same. And to participate in that Q&A session, please do use the GoToWebinar facility on the panel beside you. That GoToWebinar facility will feed the questions into me, and I will introduce them into the conversation. All of your questions will, of course, be sent on to Ian and Dionysios, even if we don't have time, so that they can come back to you. And the slides are already posted and will remain posted so that you can peruse them at your leisure. But with no further ado, may I hand the floor to you, Dionysios.
Michael, thank you very much, and a very warm welcome from me as well. Thank you also for hosting us. Now, for me, the story of technology in AML is a fascinating one. I wrote my book on this back in 2008, as you can see from this subtle book promo, where the cover takes about half the page. Now, what I find fascinating is that while technology has changed, and while we do have some new entries in the AML party, the systemic character of technology, that is the systems-wide effects of technology, remain quite similar. Now, I've split this up into a number of key phenomena, 9 plus 1 to be accurate. And the first one is the systemic character of technology itself. Now, this goes against current beliefs about AML technology. For example, if one looks closely at the proposed economic crime plan that's underway until 2022, technology is largely seen as a subsystem of an infrastructure box that supports enforcement, intelligence agencies, regulators, supervisors, the private sector, and so on. So technology is seen as a tool. This is a profound misconception of the interference of technology in AML. While information sharing is significant as one of the 7 key strategic priorities, and I'll get to that in a minute, the perception of technology that sees it as a tool to support AML is misplaced, as technology is a system on its own, and it interferes with AML like ink on paper. It creates complex patterns of interference. Not all of them are evident. Not all of them are visible, as layers upon layers of information systems develop into a significant complexity. Even for single financial institutions, the interoperability concerns, the RBA implementations, databases that degenerate, risk scorings, etc., they all commingle to interact with the complexities of other institutions. One of these interference patterns is the SARS increase through technology that has amplified internal noise and made it available externally. So information sharing in AML is not really information sharing. At best, it is data sharing, though more often it is just sharing noise. The overwhelming majority of SARs end up as archived cases. In fact, I propose that they should just be renamed as suspicious archived reports. Every time a SAR is being sent to the FIU, and this is how I would dream of a send a SAR button to look like. I hope the animation is working here. I declare sympathy to the banks and imagine designing an MLRO class 101 on defensive reporting that translates to send as many SARs to the FIU as possible. Now, what is common sense under conditions of extreme information asymmetry has become stigmatized. In that context, the underlying function of technology is clear for some. As an MLRO said to me in a conference, technology allows us to send almost everything to the FIU. It's wonderful. Besides, how are we supposed to know whether the case is in a national context does not make sense. No wonder that FIUs are swimming in an ocean of SARs. But even though these effects start in a localized manner, they escalate and propagate quickly. Some prosecutors have had enough. Just a few months ago, in July 2020, the Osnabrück prosecutors in Germany raided the FIU's offices and instigated criminal proceedings against FIU officers for obstruction of justice, while they, in turn, were obstructed by a backlog of 46,000 SARs. Now, what a wonderful irony that the oversubmission of SARs has turned FIU officials into suspects themselves. This brings me to phenomenon 3. Whenever complex interactions between bureaucracies use technology to communicate, they simply recreate electrocracy, or a computerized bureaucracy, if you like. SARS backlogs is just one manifestation of that. So in that state, the distinction between suspicious and non-suspicious transactions comes to impact organizations, and in doing so, it creates dependencies between them and the technologies they utilize. Here's one example. The true positive rate of a transaction monitoring system can be thought of in this way. While many see large numbers of false positives and think of technological implementations in AML as a disaster, there is another optimistic chunk of the pie that sees them as just great or rather successful. Ironically, the latter two relate to similar true positive rates, divergent to about 10%. So there's a very thin line between pessimism and optimism in AML technology. Yet the optimism is unwarranted, because in all cases, how algorithms represent suspicion can be tweaked to consider organizational demands. For example, adjusted so that only an X number of suspects appears in front of AML analysts in a day, because that's what they have capacity for. But of course, the real true positive rate, if one were to consider successful asset confiscation originating from a SAR, would be infinitesimal. The algorithmic gaming of suspicious behavior is seen as a necessary on this occasion, as a lot of money is being spent per year for looking into false positives. Staff are demoralized from having to deal with daily junk technology-oriented alerts, and regulators are often puzzled as to how exactly AML technology effectiveness can be considered. So it is in this context that many have sought refuge into large-scale transaction manipulation, visualization approaches, analytics, and the like. Here's one that we did for a UK bank many years ago in an EU-funded project using about 300 million financial transactions. Now, that led to a realization that in anti-money laundering, suspicion and complexity change form, but not substance. In other words, logical complexity in algorithms can mutate to visual complexity. While these challenges are piling up, many have seen artificial intelligence or some branches of it as carrying considerable potential for advancing the AML agenda. While some potential is there, for example, in active learning or in branches of AI that can be used to extract intelligence from the narrative of SARS, AI is not going to give meaning to suspicion. And this is a fundamental problem with AML AI. As John Searle puts it, the syntax is not sufficient for the semantics, or else you cannot expect AI to give meaning to a subjective and fragile construct like suspicion. This matters for phenomenon 6 as well, the datafication of money laundering. Here we have complex lifestyle, business, criminal behaviors, and these need to collapse into numbers and symbols upon which the algorithms can operate. So this implies an automatic loss in AML intelligence, without which profiling is meaningless. But there is a more interesting question here, Michael. While detection will never be perfect, how good does it need to get so that it can start acting as a deterrent for money laundering? So what's the threshold looking like? Will we ever get to that point? Meanwhile, the very concept of profiling itself introduces algorithmic bias on many different levels. This is where racial, gender, and other profiling indicators can be embedded in monitoring money laundering, often as proxy indicators. All selections imply that AI trained on datasets with biases would replicate these across different categories. But the fundamental flaw in looking at this is the belief that biases can be eliminated altogether. So all this is happening against a backdrop where, and this is going to have significant impact in AML, where face-to-face transacting is going to become eventually obsolete, cutting off a key detection channel and putting more pressure on technology. Real-time deepfakes have the potential to severely compromise remote KYC, and cryptocurrencies designed for cyber money laundering will rise. This is where my hypothetical creamy coin comes in. In a much more secure alternative to Bitcoin, if Zcoin and the hundreds of others privacy-oriented cryptocurrencies will not suffice, we can have online crowd crime sourcing of cyber money laundering, which will be brokered through new cryptocurrencies designed for and by cyber money launderers. And we can have criminal smart contracts that can be executed online. The final phenomenon is perhaps the hardest to digest. We will get a subtle technological construction of criminality. Some systems operate as proper black boxes. If they come up with suspects under emergent computational conditions, i.e., we don't exactly know how they've done it because of the machine learning or deep learning setup, are we going to accept the results? What are the legal admissibility and ethical issues raised in this process? Viewed in this way, we can think of technology as constructing suspects in the process. So, who gets to be analyzed, archived, or prosecuted further is subjected to this technological pre-construction of criminality. And if these phenomena are not plenty, you can think of any non-linear combination of the former 9, and I hope this should raise more concerns about how we should be thinking about technology in anti-money laundering, not as a tool, but as a system on its own. Michael, thank you very much. Over to you, and thank you once again for hosting us.
Dionysius, that was very rich. We're going to have a lot to discuss, I can tell, and I've got quite a few questions flooding in. But if I could, Ian, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Michael. My name is Ian Angell. I'm known as the Angel of Doom, and that'll become apparent as I proceed. I'm a student of the absurd. I see absurdities everywhere, none more so than in anti-money laundering. And now these absurdities are being computerized. To me, it all resembles the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Perhaps I'm wrong. Hopefully someone in the audience who works on the coalface will put me straight. There are 5 actors involved: the launderers, let's call them the banks, the regulators, national and international, and the police and the courts. The courts are reasonably transparent. Their decisions and the reasons for making them are mostly on the record. Not that there have been many successful ML cases, thus the police have had very little input. All but the most incompetent launderers study AML systems and successfully bypass the hurdles. The banks and the regulators aren't as savvy. When a launderer is caught, usually because someone has informed on them, and hardly ever through anti-money laundering, only the most superficial lessons are learned. Now, if the number of successful prosecutions is a measure of success in anti-money laundering, then clearly AML is an unmitigated failure. However, if the measure is how much the banks are being fined, or the sums of money being spent on AML, or the number of people employed in AML, or the number of suspicious activity reports submitted, then it is a rip-roaring success. The cost in man-hours is quite staggering. It's easy to see why the promises of technology are so appealing to the banks. AML compliance keeps growing and growing. It's a job creation scheme for bureaucrats and a happy hunting ground for technology salesmen. It's a huge investment. Sadly, computerizing failure always leads to failure. Quite absurd. Although the most absurd situation is the relationship between the regulators and the banks. No rational person can look at this without laughing. Take the FATF, which goes on and on about how being fined by the regulators is a huge reputational risk. Stalin so wisely commented, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. One non-compliance fine is a tragedy, 1,000 fines is the price of doing business." How long before every single bank has been fined? Many, multiple times. Compliance bureaucracy is unstoppable. To think that the FATF was supposed to dissolve itself after producing its 40 recommendations. A fat chance. In fact, compliance is far more than a bureaucracy. It's become an industry. Banks are up against a swarm of all-powerful regulators, and you can't fight City Hall. So what are the first thoughts of a bureaucracy in respect of costs? Well, pass as much of the work, and then the costs, as possible onto those being regulated. Just like VAT, which is the most efficient savings with tax. Number 2, levy fines to offset your own costs. This ever-expanding slime mold of compliance has to be paid for, mostly by the banks, in fines, in the burgeoning AML departments, and in technology. So many in the banking sector are from the pixie dust school of technology. You sprinkle technology on a problem and something wonderful will happen. Hence, I expect an even bigger investment in AML technology in the future. Talk about the blind leading the blind. Meanwhile, the regulators are pushing the absurdity they proudly call risk-based approach. To quote the FATF, a risk-based approach means that countries, competent authorities, and banks identify, assess, and understand the money laundering and terrorist financing risk to which they are exposed, and take the appropriate mitigation measures in accordance with the level of risk. What this actually means is that ultimately everybody is going to dump all responsibility onto the piggy in the middle, the banks. Banks have no option other than to look to technology as the only way out of this money pit. Both sides, the banks and the regulators, are in denial over the ambiguity behind the notion of risk. Risk is highly subjective. Each side sees it differently. For example, the regulators don't realize that from the bank's perspective, the biggest risk is not being caught facilitating money laundering, it's being fined. So look up my YouTube video to see what I mean by risk and why the FATF interpretation of risk is totally absurd. All communication is asymmetric. Sender and receiver will understand each message differently. The trick is to ensure the sender-receiver pair don't fall into the chaos of a compounded misunderstanding. This requires a continuous feedback stream, and yet from their side, the banks swamp the regulators with false positive suspicious activity reports, while the regulators give little or no feedback on the value of the reports. There's no feedback. Behind the regulator's stance is the bureaucrat's golden rule. Ignorance of our rules is no excuse. The regulators go one step further, saying, we won't tell you of our rules because then it's so much easier to fine you for non-compliance. Does any outsider understand the way regulators set the level of fines? I find it baffling. Added to the absurdity is the fallacy of the fictional individual. Each bank is an agglomeration of people and procedures. Thinking of a bank as an individual is absurd. Laundering could well be the combined actions of various employees, none of whom is aware that they are part of a clever laundering scheme. And then, if laundering is uncovered, which individual is responsible? Who is to blame? Then we have fines, not for laundering itself, because if it was, then there wouldn't be any fines, but for failings in AML procedures. And how does bank management view these fines? Possibly as a tax on their profits. I believe 1% seems to be the going rate. Or more likely, it's the price of a peaceful life. As for AML technology, what exactly does it do? It's simple. It profiles. It looks for patterns in the way money flows in and out of banks and links this to customers identified as suspicious. In today's software, at least the profiling patterns make sense to us humans. However, artificial intelligence is invading AML. And as with neural nets, software is often unable to externalize the patterns it uses in a way that we humans can understand. Since regulators are human, believe it or not, how can they make claims about non-compliance when they can't analyze the procedures? Did I say regulators are human? Well, only until artificial intelligence invades the regulatory domain. AI is already making inroads into the legal profession. Soon we will have a situation where there are no people involved. Everything will be done automatically, quickly, and at lower costs. It'll achieve just the same. The courts too could be automated. Authority for AML will be completely handed over to AI in the ultimate absurdity. The banks should respond with the Three Musketeers strategy. all for one and one for all. Use the same AML compliance software. So the regulators, human or automated, can't find a single bank without finding them all. And when it's all AI and there are no people involved, AML technology will have become judge, jury, and executioner. Of course, it won't catch any more launderers. It's quite absurd. Thank you.
Well, Ian, excellent, and Dionysios as well. I've got quite a few questions out there. Folks, just a reminder to get your questions in quickly. If you send them in about 2 minutes ahead of time, I won't, unfortunately, be able to feed them in. But we do have quite a few comments. Just a quick one from me. As you were talking, Dionysios, about suspicious activity reports, the SARS, you use this. You put up this lovely word, and I'm going to say it, but I'd really rather hear it from you because it's Greek. So, electrocracy, was it you said?
Yes, yes. Well, it's a combination of electronic bureaucracy. So I made up the word in one of my papers or in my book, and it was just to signify one of the phenomena that I was seeing within the context of AML, that whereas the implementation of technology was thought to speed up things, all that it did is that it sped up things over a very confined organizational domain, and then created massive backlogs in other parts of the system or in other parts within and without the organization. So with the concept of electrocracy, we're essentially denoting this friction within organizations. So banks, for example, implement transaction monitoring systems. The algorithms are optimized, however long that process may be, and they throw up hundreds and thousands of alerts. So this creates an electronic bureaucracy that then has to be forcefully reduced by the money laundering analysts themselves.
I'm going to throw it around. We've got quite a few comments here, quite a few complimentary ones too, and quite a few, as ever, wondering what do we do. So let's get cracking. Ian, here's one for you from Shan Turnbull, who I believe is dialing in from Australia. What is the problem of tagging all transactions with their ultimate beneficial owners and or controllers of transactions to create a traceable record for anybody to search and identify money laundering or other criminal activities? And then he continues on a comment: surely privacy should be a concern for honest transactions.
Well, that statement is full of ambiguities. Practically every word has an ambiguous meaning. Honesty, for example. I don't know. Coming from Wales, I don't know what honest means. Taffy was a Welshman. Taffy was a thief. That's the English perception of the Welsh. So, are they being honest? And often, maybe laundering is a perfectly valid response. If you live in a country where the banks tell the criminals that there's been a money transfer, and then the criminals then blackmail you to get the money out, then surely getting money into a country without the authorities knowing is the only honest, sensible thing to do. So these words are all variously interpreted. And so the idea that there's a rational, absolute understanding is just not the case.
Dionysios, a couple of quick ones, because just to bring the audience up to speed here. Bob McDowell, who's dialing in from the Channel Islands, is curious. At the moment, do FIUs address and investigate on a first-in, first-out basis, or do they do a preliminary ranking of risk importance based on some assessment?
Well, in the overwhelming majority of cases, based on the FIU reports that I've seen, there is always some prioritization. So there is a risk-based, a second order, if you like, risk-based approach implemented at the FIU level, because that prioritization needs to happen because of the sheer volume of SARS in many cases.
Okay.
And this is the example in Germany where the prosecutor actually went into the FIU because of the 46,000 SARS of a backlog.
But you've got the example here of where the definition of risk in the FIU and the definition of risk in the bank and the definition of risk in the police are all different. So they are not even talking, they're using the same words, but they're not using the same language. And that's why the risk-based approach is totally absurd.
It's probably time I told the two of you, I've just recently joined an economic crime gold squad at the Home Office, and I'm beginning to see the difference, though, in what we're looking for from a Home Office perspective, what we're looking for as a financial institution, wider than just banks, but also including lawyers and accountants, and what we're looking at.
A country benefits if sufficient flows of cash come in.
Yeah. Let's pick up just a couple more quick comments, Dionysius. Bob wanted also to know, has any data analysis been conducted to determine what scenarios are most likely to indicate successful AML prosecutions?
Well, every country has its own processes in that, but from what I've seen, this is very much a cultural issue as well, because there are different lifestyle, behavioral patterns, criminal patterns in different institutions. So this is an ongoing exploration, if you like, and I'd just like to say hi to Bob as well. It's been quite some time since we met.
Okay.
And example in Italy where they used various profiling techniques to look for launderers, and they didn't find any. But what they found was loan sharks. So they successfully discovered loan sharks and prosecuted them, but no money launderers.
Matthew Leach is curious, has the high cost of AML work increased the complexity and the cost of the task of money laundering for criminals? Does anybody legitimate know how problematic they find it?
Sorry, Michael, can you repeat the question, because I've missed one part of it?
So the criminals, on the other hand, are actually trying to get around these systems. Has anybody done work on whether or not they are really inconveniencing them or increasing their costs?
I certainly can't recall seeing any academic work on this front, but with so many options available, with purely digital banks, with the sheer variety that has been opened up by cryptocurrencies, by different investment opportunities, by remote, everything is online now. I wouldn't think that there are too many barriers of getting money in and out. There is, of course, some friction in the formal financial system, but there is also a lot of vibrant activity in the underground Hawala type systems where money flows in and out pretty quickly.
Ian, one for you. Bob is curious. Fines for AML are becoming a noticeable contributor to national exchequers. Can they afford to lose the contribution from the AML industry?
Well, this is all taxation is theft, and this is just the latest form of stealing off the commercial sector. Because of a bloated public sector, then it has to be funded somehow. And not only is the fines going to fund the AML, they're also going to fund general things in society. So no, governments worldwide are looking for new ways of taxing, and AML is just one way of doing
that. If I can quickly make a comment on that, there are many ironies into this process. There are branches of, for example, the Caribbean FATF was self-funded by confiscated assets. There's money that flows back into the legitimate financial system through government transactions. Following asset confiscation, even that little, there's a percentage cut for law enforcement if there is a successful prosecution. So, but in the case of financial fines, that is even more interesting, because you have to start asking, at what point does a financial fine be levied, and should the banks actually be modeling, in terms of their own forecasting, the frequency of financial fines and the level of financial fines in other banks, so that they can prevent themselves, sort of profile their own future exposure to this. There are many ironies within the financial crime related fines.
Let me pick up one more for Dionysius, and then one for you, Ian. Richard Sage says, Dionysius, you raise excellent concerns, but the answer is surely that technology should be considered as a tool under human control. So is your suggestion that technology is not a tool a recommendation or a statement of the problem? And I think related to this, Stavros Katsios writes to you, could technology be used as an excuse for maintaining traditional bureaucracy without even a full application? So this combination of the system issue.
So on the second one from Stavros, I think technology is being used as an excuse to amplify and at the same time depress traditional bureaucratic structures. This is studied quite well in the information systems literature, for example, and there are aspects of computerized bureaucracy that come into play. So it is an excuse to a large degree. Now, on the first one, if I remember the question correctly now, the perception of technology as a tool is the misconception that shouldn't be there, really. Technology is implemented as a tool, and it is commonly thought of as something that enables organizations to function and to do certain actions, to spot money laundering, for example, and so on. Now, what I'm saying is that perception is fundamentally flawed within anti-money laundering, because technology creates much deeper systemic effects that do not stay within the confines of the organization. And in some cases, the auditability of these systems and the ripple out effects that they have are not even easy to observe or categorize or consider. So that's the key distinction.
It was used as if tools are self-evidently beneficial. A hammer, the first use of a hammer was to knock a nail in, and the second use is to hit somebody over the head with it. So it's not, all of these words are used as if they're good and they're beneficial, and they're highly complex and variable.
The most, Ian, I think, just a quick parenthesis. I think the phrase that captures best this contingency is how vendors approach it. They call them AML solutions.
Right? Solutions, yes.
Good point. Ian, Richard Sage is quite taken with you. We need more people like Ian Angell to think independently and speak out. Ian's solution is elegant, but difficult to get all banks to agree.
No, there are no such things as solutions, only contingencies, and they always fail eventually.
Contingency is elegant, but difficult to get all banks to agree on using the same AML, as you said. How about getting governments to set up regulators who fine banks for inconveniencing customers by blocking their access to banking?
Well, of course, it's inevitable, because governments are always looking ways to steal money off everybody. So, but will it change anything? Will it achieve anything? No, nothing at all. This is what I said. It's become an industry. It's become a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. The whole thing is insane. If you took it all away, there'd be no difference. Things would carry on. So all of this money is being spent, is being poured down the hole, and nothing is achieved, or very little is achieved. And most achievements in anti-money laundering are because a divorced wife has ratted on her ex-husband. That's where most of the criminal cases come from.
Michael, if I can make a quick comment on that. I was recently contacted by an organization. I'm not going to name the country. It is within the EU. And there's a potential PhD student there starting to do work on this. And it's incredible that there was about 40% of complaints to the independent authority in that country that the AML regulations have been causing too many problems for accessing the banking system. So that effect is very much becoming more prominent and more significant with the introduction of new AML measures. So that balance is very thin.
Ian, Humans Saeed Zanutzi is curious. Why are the UK authorities so slow in addressing the system if it's so important? Why are they not changing it, improving it, and really trying to combat money laundering?
Because they don't know. Look, just because you're elected doesn't make you wise. That's the folly of democracy. You end up with pretty boys in elected and not people who actually know what they're talking about. Mm. And okay. We're back to describing the British government again. And I'm a Tory, so there we are. So it's
but perhaps we should frame that as a question. We should frame that as a question. What is a successful AML national system?
Yeah.
Because if it's the employment of people, it's wonderful. It's a huge success.
Gonna finish on two questions. One for Dionysios, and then one for both of you. Dionysios, back to sort of this feedback loop issue. It's from Rob Leslie. With the advent of new collaborative computational methods, such as secure multi-party computation, do you see the possibility of any significant improvements in false positive rates and true positive rates?
Actually, I'm working on a paper on just that topic. I do think there is some potential in sort of reconceptualizing the distribution of the suspicious activity reporting regime and seeing some collaborative spaces of computation and how that would play out. I cannot hypothesize as to the effectiveness of that. And one of the arguments that I'm putting forward is that the data protection authorities should actually step in on this, much like how they've done it in France in several occasions. And these collaborative AML efforts should be brokered within and in between DPOs. But I do see some potential in this exploration.
Oh God, data protection is another industry, yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap kind of three comments together because, and I know Ian, this for many years of working with you, it always frustrates you. But all right, it's the system's bust. But between the two of you, have you got any suggestions? And Annette Nabavi wants to know if technology can't catch money launderers, what can? Richard Jones is, so what are three suggestions to help bank CEOs through this dysfunctional Mad Max environment? And Matthew Leach is asking, how could money laundering be made more difficult to do? So, I myself have proposed things like actually having access to an anonymized SARS database so we know at least what's going on, or feedback back to the prosecution. We've also talked about, various types of transactional databases that might be there and vendors might be allowed to test against them. Lots of suggestions out there, but if you were trying to improve the system, what would be, to take Annette's words, Richard Jones's words, what would sort of be three suggestions the two of you might offer?
Well, I have a problem with the word improve. Things don't get better, they get different. So, no. My one advice is for the banks to gang together and fight back. Stop being so passive and actually threaten the FIUs and say, stop it. Unless you have specific examples of laundering, then leave us alone and stop fining us, and we just pay up for a peaceful life. And because there's no proof, they pay up and there's no guilt involved. If there's no guilt, there should be no fine.
And Dionysios?
Well, I think the issue of feedback from the FIU to the banks is something which we've been discussing for 15 years. It's now starting to see some light in the day. The issue of collaborative approaches to SARS, brokered through third parties, trusted third parties like DPOs, is one potential way ahead. I think overall, while technology is of course unavoidable in this context, there is a lot of potential in rethinking the entire system, really. Because of these complex phenomena.
That is essential is that the FIUs must explain how they calculate the fines.
Regulators.
Where are the numbers coming from? That's the big thing. And if the banks understand where the fines are coming from and how they're calculated, then they'll be able to deal with the risk. But when you don't know where the fine is coming from left field, how can you deal with it as a risk?
Well, I'm going to have to draw this to a close, sadly, but only because of time. I'm getting a lot of good thank yous in. I'll be feeding all these back to you, as I said earlier. I'm taking away quite a bit. By the way, Ian, you might find it interesting, but the Financial Services Group of Limited Companies Task Force, one of its recommendations is very related to your bit about the fines, which is make it a fixed per instance fine so that you know how to calculate it and look at the risk in it. And that would force would force the regulators to explain, because the fine would be based on the number of genuine circumstances. Anyway, I've taken a lot from this. A couple of comments here. Ian, you spoke about computerizing failure. Dionysios, I liked your point there that AI is not going to give meaning to suspicion. And what I think is interesting is this is a microcosm. AML is one electrocracy, bureaucracy, where we're reinforcing all this. And I wonder if the two of you might come back and maybe we ought to be exploring other pockets and corners where we're seeing exactly this sort of behavior. If I was to add a 10th proposition to your phenomena, Dionysios, it would be that just because we can apply technology doesn't make anything more efficient. And I think that's one great belief that everybody has. But the two of you have been super. It's been very, very challenging, and I sadly need to turn and give 3 quick rounds of thanks. My first round of thanks, as ever, to our sponsors who are very, very, many of them very deeply involved in this space, some of them suffering and some of them selling solutions, as you point out. I'd like to thank the audience. You've been very vibrant today, as ever. It's a delight to have you here. It's very much a team effort. We've got 2 events coming up. And a very interesting one tomorrow with Michael Schellenberger, a committed environmentalist who nevertheless believes that a lot of what we're doing environmentalism, particularly the alarmism, is actually hurting the cause. And then on Friday, hopefully something to get you off on the holidays. We have Dr. Raj Persaud telling us how should we panic in a pandemic, how to do it properly. So those will be fun. As ever, go and check out the website. But lastly, Dionysios and Ian, always great to see the two of you back. It's great to see old friends, and it's great to chat. And I wish we just had more time. I know you will do that some other time, but I have to say the audience really appreciated it. And I can't open the floodgates of applause, but I have got a technological device here. This is my Korean karmic clapper, which will substitute for the audience. So I have technology too. Thank you very, very much, and we hope to see you back soon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for hosting us, and it's lovely to be with you.